So let's take a minute to talk about a cassette deck that was released in the late 1970s. These sold through the early 1980 and maybe 1981 if they were on clearance. I remember selling these when I worked in a catalog showroom called Service Merchandise, used to be Standard Sales. And I sold quite a few of these. Now this is a Pioneer CT-F900. Now the CT-F900 was the introductory version of the large Pioneer cassette decks released in the late 1970s. This deck did not feature a setting for metal tapes. So you're all familiar with metal tapes that were released in the late 70s, early 80s. And here's an example of one. This is a Maxell MX110. This is a metal tape. The difference is that the oxide that is on a chromium dioxide or a different kind of tape is actually an oxide. The metal particle tapes actually have metal particles embedded in the tape itself. This meant that you would get a better magnetizing rate on the tape. They called it coercivity. Now, this deck will actually record on a metal tape, but its bias will sound wrong. So this deck is made for 3 tape types. The old-fashioned standard or low noise, ferrochrome, which were produced for a very short period of time. You can still find some ferrochrome tapes on eBay. I don't recommend buying them. Or chromium dioxide or CrO2. And actually, that's a ferric chromium or cobalt oxidation that's on those tapes. And that is probably the most popular that ever was released. And that's what you'll find on eBay if you want to look for new tapes. They sound perfectly fine. In this deck, they sound very good. Now, this deck has 3 tape heads. That is, has an erase head, it has a record head, a play head, and it only goes in one direction. The record head can start the recording and you can actually listen to the recording being played back as it's being recorded. And I'm going to show you how that works. This also has a bias fine adjustment where you can alter the bias of what's recorded on the tape. It will brighten up the sound in some cases and it will dull it in some cases. It does feature Dolby. Now, it's just Dolby B. It is not Dolby C. Now, I'm pointing these things out because I want you to know that when you buy this deck, do not expect to get Dolby C. It wasn't produced at the time this deck came out. But it does have regular Dolby noise reduction. And it also has a mic input that you can select. That's what this input select is for here. And then there's a dual left-right output that you can select. So this is your input, your output. You can select whether your input or output is mic or line. Turn Dolby on, choose, and it says auto CrO2. Well, that's because the chromium dioxide tapes actually have a little extra notch right there. And if there's a feeler for it, and this deck has it, it will say, oh, it's a chromium dioxide tape. So if I take this off, and you notice right now the light is on, but if I had put a regular tape in, the light would go off. But it is sensing that it's a CrO2 tape. So enough of me talking. We're going to go ahead and start playing something. I'm going to talk about one more feature. Since this is not an auto reverse deck, when it gets to the end of the tape, sure would be nice if it might rewind itself and play again. Well, guess what? That's exactly what it does. See this memory repeat? Memory repeat is set so that when you set it to end, when it finishes playing, it'll rewind and play that side again. You can also stop or rewind at a counter position, and you can play it from there. So this also has a timer start. And this is the old-fashioned way of being able to make your tape recorder or player function on an external timer that would actually turn on the system. And when the system turns on, if this is set to play, it will start playing. If it's set to record, it will start recording. And that was for when you wanted to record a radio show or something like that was broadcast. But right now I've got it set to play. I'm going to turn the power on, and you can see it will start. Okay? So now what we're going to do is we're going to record some music so that you can see how that works. And we're going to monitor it. I'm going to change over to tape so that you can see, or actually hear, how it's recording. I'm going to use YouTube library to do it, and I'm going to start the record now. Now that is recording onto the tape, and that's the third head playing it back. This output will govern how loud it is coming out, but it's not affecting the record input levels. This will. When on source, this is the record input level, and it's pretty high. You might want to back it off a little bit. That's with no Dolby, and that's with Dolby. The meter, I can do a peak hold, or I can do an average. Now what we're going to do is I'm going to start this over again, and I'm going to play with the bias so that you can see how that works. This is the source. That's actually been recorded on the tape. Tends to get a little duller to the right. A little brighter to the left. Just about right in the middle. take the Dolby off. Now what we're going to do is we're going to take the top off, we're going to look inside and talk about some of the things that have changed or have been worked on since I received the deck. There were quite a few things wrong with this deck. The first thing that was wrong with this deck is the rewind motor was actually disconnected physically. The second thing that was wrong was all of the belts were worn or were stretched, so I had to replace them. The third thing that was wrong is it had a speed variance problem. It was not playing at the right speed. Another problem was when you went to record, it wouldn't fully erase on one of the tracks. So rather than go through and replace all the capacitors, I went through and changed some of the capacitors that I measured and found were out of spec. But for the most part, when I would measure a capacitor, they seemed to be in pretty good shape. The capacitors, what happens with these units is these electrolytic capacitors, these black capacitors, tend to be the capacitors that have problems. However, I didn't find any capacitors that were really out of spec. The only capacitors I've changed were the ones that were in the equalization circuit, and the ones that I changed were really close anyway. I didn't really have to, but since I'd pulled them, I went ahead and replaced them. All of the rest of the capacitors that I've measured, where I pulled a leg and just tested, they seem to be fine. So I went on to make sure that all of the other adjustments were correct that I did with an oscilloscope to make sure that they were working properly. It records, plays, equalization's fine. The only other thing that I did do that I think you need to know about is I took this motor apart. That's why it's got some red electrical tape on it. That's just making sure the back is held on. There's a motor, there's actually a motor inside this housing. I took this apart and I serviced it. And what that means is I cleaned the armature, cleaned the parts that are inside, the bearings, made sure that they were greased but not oiled, so there isn't an overabundance of oil inside. There are other parts that need to be cleaned while I was in there. I put it all back together, and now it actually has torque, so it will rewind a tape perfectly, and it will stop and turn off. It will fast forward the tape. It doesn't stop in the middle. What was happening is I was having torque problems with it, where halfway through the tape it would stop, and if I had this set to automatic play at the end, then it would think it was at the end, and of course it was not at the end, and it would start playing, or the take-up reel would stop taking up, and that was a problem because let to go too long, it would consume a tape. But you can see I just rewound it. I have it on automatic play on rewind, and it has no problem whatsoever. The brushes in the motor on the armature were perfectly fine. I just cleaned those off with a cotton swab. It does have some centrifugal switches inside. I cleaned their contacts to make sure that they were making good contact. The whole point of that is to make sure that when the motor is on, that it doesn't go, it's a governor, it doesn't go out of, it doesn't go too fast, and when it stops, it doesn't keep trying to power at the same amount. So what you can see is, and you can see how well this works. No problem. So the rest of the inside circuitry, the only other things that I did was use deoxit on the switching components. Typically, I will unsolder them from the board and take them apart and clean them. I did not do that with this deck. It didn't seem to need it. The recording and playback seems to work fine. I don't necessarily recommend you buy this for recording, although it works fine. It's going to be a good playback deck, but it will record. In fact, obviously you just saw me record this music, and it records very well. There's not a problem with that. But the deck is probably going to be better for playback than anything else. But certainly you saw it record. It records just fine. And I've taken these tapes and played them in other cassette decks, and they sound perfectly fine. So again, one of the things that I showed you a little earlier, and this will close out the video, remember the repeat, counter, end, or off? Well, if I want it to repeat at counter, when I rewind it or fast forward it and it comes back to 0, it'll start again from there. See? If I say repeat end, then it will rewind completely. And start playing again. So it'll get to the very end of the tape, and I'm going to actually turn it over so you can see that. It'll play to the end of the tape. And then it'll play that side over. Now, to test this, to make sure that it's working, I have put a tape in and let it play back and forth for an entire day. And it had no problem whatsoever. And you can tell from the rewind here, there's no problem with torque. There's no problem with the rewind mechanism. And I put a good tape in. Some tapes kind of have a squeal, and you're not sure if it's a tape or the mechanism, the tape mechanism, the system mechanism. And you can see that that's working just fine. So when you go to bid or purchase this, realize you are buying something that has been partially refurbished. I say partially refurbished because I did not recap the entire system. I don't think it needs it. It has been mechanically serviced. And oh, by the way, I did set the azimuth properly. I have an azimuth reference tape that I use to set the azimuth of the heads. It was a bit off. It's been thoroughly cleaned. It has all new belts and tires inside. But that's it. I haven't done any recapping. I haven't done anything outside of the minor adjustments that needed to be made to the bias, internal bias circuit and equalization, but everything else is as it was when I received it. So, as I said, bid or buy this, understand you are buying something that is from 1980 or 1979. Understand that when you receive it, if it works for 6 months, great. If it works for 6 years, better. If you have a problem with it, anytime you own it, it is old equipment. So that's why I'm putting this on YouTube. That's why I'm linking this to my eBay. I want you to know what you're buying, what you're getting. And if you look at any of my other eBay videos on electronic equipment, you'll see I do the same thing with everything that I service. Well, I hope that works for you. And thanks for watching this video.